And we are, as a people, inherently and historically
Wake up!
opposed to secret societies, the secret oaths, and the secret proceedings.
The show that asks questions about why we don't ask questions.
What the hell is going on?
This is Conspiracy Queries with Alan Park. Welcome to Conspiracy Queries with Alan Park. I am Alan Park. These are Conspiracy Queries. Looks like we have some spring for a minute or two and then plunge right back into a blizzard. Thanks, Mother Nature, or us, whoever ruined it. We've got a great guest on the show today. Carlos Morales is a former Child Protection Services worker who no longer works there. Some bad things happened. He saw them, and he couldn't stomach it. So he's going to tell us about it and tell us how we can protect ourselves from their tentacles. The Child Protection Services, also known as an unnecessary government agency, join the list. Okay, if you were someone who managed to alter, say, a water filtration system in a small town, say you replaced what they really needed to make the water filtration system work properly with cheaper things due to budgetary cuts that you thought were unnecessary, and simultaneously propping up larger corporations with unfair advantages economically. But if you were the person who managed to alter that water filtration system by doing that, and then as a result of that, it affected people's health, and some of them even died because of it, and you did it anyway, or maybe you were too stupid to know that it would affect the health of people to lessen the amount of money available for a water filtration system, thus killing off people in a town. Maybe you were too stupid to know that, and you did it anyway. Should you get away with it? If you were instrumental in devising a regressive control system, implementing it and lying about its shortcomings and puffing it up with bogus importance, where personal welfare for human beings is frowned upon as unsustainable and corporation welfare increases. And if you were part of that corporate world and you eroded those humanitarian safety nets to the point where more people died and even more criminals profited and lived high on the hog because of your actions, what would happen to you? What do you think would happen to you? What if that control system drained much-needed cash out of municipal budgets and, say, like schools and hospitals and hospital equipment and nurses being fired and other social necessities, and you decided to step in there and find a way to shut that down, all the while providing corporate welfare to massive companies that can be rolling in millions of dollars, that you're helping them with skewed rules that you help to draw. What if you were that guy? What would happen to you? What if you found a way to let other people who work for certain companies, what if you were able to allow them to spew their toxic bilge into the ecosystems of water and earth from which we all derive our food and our life? What if you were the guy that set those policies up? What would happen to you? What if you, say, designed a new wrinkle in the banking system so everybody's involved there, like everybody in the whole country? What if you designed a new wrinkle in the banking system that was able to take the money away from depositors and citizens? Your money. What if you were the guy that was able to come up with a system that just said, we're going to take your money out of the bank, just like they did in Cyprus, exactly the same thing? What if you were the guy that drew up that policy? What would happen to you? What would happen if you sat down and tried to dismantle Canada's banking system to the point where it was much more like the American banking system, with less responsibility and accountability to the people that run the bank? And what if you were able to get away with trying to do that and no one really held your feet to the fire before the economic collapse? Tried hard, you did, to rejig the system and take out the safety for people and to make it more like the American system. And what if the Canadian people said, oh, well, no, wait a minute. No, we don't want to do that. What if you sat down and tried to dismantle the banking system to the point where it was much more like the American banking system with less responsibility and accountability from the people that actually run the bank? What if you were able to get away with that, like they did in Cyprus, where they set up your bank account and you wouldn't even know about it and they could just take all your money? What if you were a guy that designed something like that for all Canadians? What would happen to you? Well, it's hard to know for sure, but anyone who can read and or has a memory knows that for years the Conservative government of Canada tried to dump the Canadian banking system, which is evidently more stable, as we see, and replace it with the American system. Why? Well, there's a lot more criminality potential in the American banking system, and the Canadian banking system was too safe for Canadians. And so enough people said, no, just leave the banking system alone. And you tried to get that change happening, yet when the collapse occurred, you tried to take credit for the success of the Canadian banking system that you were trying to dismantle. What would happen to you if you were a guy that did something like that? What if you were pious enough to take credit for this slightly more successful journey through the recession that Canada had, while completely ignoring the fact that you had championed its citizen-based protection? What would happen to somebody like that? Well, if that person did exist, and he did all of those things to the citizens of Canada and against the citizens of Canada, using the citizens of Canada's money the whole time, if you did that, well, they'd probably give you a state funeral and be all sad about it. Only the people who really don't understand the true legacy of the man who is no longer with us. The Prime Minister of Canada does not speak for all Canadians when he says, on behalf of all Canadians, we're very sorry to see this happen. That's a lie as well. So I guess they haven't really learned anything at all. So if it's all the same to you, I'm going to go outside right now, and while this state funeral is going on, I'm going to put my Canadian flag back up to full mast. Hey, let's go talk to Carlos Morales from the CPS. We are here with Carlos Morales, and it's great that he's here. Carlos came to my attention, of course, through the wonderful research abilities of my producer, Morgan Flood. It falls upon me to mention Morgan. He's half the team and does a great job. So thanks a lot for finding Carlos, who used to work for Child Protection Services in the United States of America and no longer does. He doesn't work there anymore. Folks, he had the job at the place, and then he's not there anymore. Why, in this economy, would someone leave a steady, regular job that I would imagine Child Protective Services is? Well, I don't know the answer to that, so I'm going to ask Carlos to tell us why he no longer works at Child Protective Services.
Absolutely. So, yeah, Alan, you were bringing up the consistent job, which it was a consistent job. It was very, very hard to get fired in such an agency. They were offering you a good amount of money, especially for the college degree I had. So there were a number of reasons, though, why I ended up quitting Child Protective Services that some people in your audience might kind of understand or empathize with.
Okay, well, let's get right to those.
Okay, so I decided to join Child Protective Services after I had witnessed child abuse occurring in public over and over again in the state of Texas that I was living in. I was living in San Antonio.
Pardon me.
There's a lot of social stratification and poverty there. And what goes with that a lot of times is a lot of abuse that is being justified over and over again in society.
You mean by making them talk in that funny accent on purpose, or what other kind of abuse do you mean?
Well, so in this particular case, it was people who were beating their children in public.
Oh, my God.
So,
in public? You mean spankings or what kind of thing?
Well, it would go from spanking to slapping in the face. So there was a wide dynamic there. And so there were altercations in which I went ahead and I stepped in on parents hitting their kids. and ended up getting physically accosted for it. So I decided, well, this seems really, really risky. I should probably go work for an agency that was supposedly created in order to prevent child abuse.
Well, I'm glad you went that way, because if a guy's okay smacking around his kid, I don't know what chance you have walking up to him.
No. Yeah, it was not the best case. And what I would actually do is put my hands behind my back. So, if there's any cameras or anything, it was very obvious that I wasn't trying to assault this person. I'm 6'3", big old Hispanic. Some people think I'm going to be trying to be physically imposing with these people. I was definitely not trying to do that, but just try to defend the child.
Okay.
So
the guy is, where is he? Are you in a shopping mall, or what are we talking about here?
Grocery store. In this particular altercation, if I remember, I ended up getting smacked in the face and thrown on the ground. And I was like, okay, well, this is fun. Which I find interesting because, if you hit an adult in the face in public, people, oh my God, I got to call the cops. I got to call these people. But if you hit your kid in the face, well, then it's immediately justified, which is rather unfortunate. So I came upon Child Protective Services. Before this, I had worked in a third-party agency in which I interviewed children who had been molested in the past. So I kind of came from a job atmosphere, well, a difficult one, nonetheless. So I decided to work for Child Protective Services. Now, I went ahead and I turned in my resume. Mind you, all I have is a college degree in sociology, which is a degree in buzzwords. It's totally worthless. And I get in there, like most college degrees, to be quite honest.
And it's worth a lot of money, though. Don't forget, you probably paid $100,000 for that thing.
Yeah, pretty much. Oh, that's not even opportunity cost. 5 years you could have been working. But
Let me just take a sidebar down that road just for 2 seconds, because it's not really on topic. But I've wanted to say this a few times. I think if you took the money that you would need to spend to say, I don't know, go to Harvard or one of these kind of places, and took the money that was the tuition money and dropped all of it on gold on the September that you were supposed to start going to that school, and then didn't even go to that school, a few years later, you'd have an unbelievable return on your gold instead of a $100,000 debt and a head full of useless knowledge.
Yeah, tell it to the people who knew about Bitcoin in 2010 and didn't invest then. And and that's when I remember hearing about Bitcoin when it was like 3 cents
Me too.
a piece. Oh my God.
I do a mini ritual suicide every day when I think about it.
Yeah, no, every single time I wake up in the morning, someone talks about Bitcoin. I'm like, oh, damn it. Anyway, so I decided I turned in my application. They took me and everything else. And how much training do you think Child Protective Services investigators have? I mean, they're supposed to understand forensics.
Are you supposed to talk with the children and the adults and sort of interact with the family at that point, or the people?
Yeah,
so I'm going to say, well, that would be worth a lot, because you're in a volatile situation. A lot of the times, I'm going to guess that it would be worth, well, more than a beat cop anyway. So I don't know, 80, 90, 100 grand, something like that.
Well, no, as in how much do you think, how much time do you think of training?
Oh, okay, sure. About as much time training as, say, the average medical doctor spends on nutrition, 45 minutes or so?
Yeah, well, it might as well have been that, because a Child Protective Service investigator has to be able to handle conflict resolution, because you're going to go into someone's house and you're going to have to deal with disputes where, there's a very good chance you're going to have a gun pulled on you every now and then. You're also going to have to understand child development, because you're going to have to interview children on their own level without accidentally, say, coaching them into the answer that you want. You're also going to have to understand forensics, because you're going to have to be able to tell if a bruise came from a spank, a punch, or a fall.
Okay. Yeah, so you're getting into like some science and forensics at this point.
Yeah, real stuff, right? And so with all that to train for to be able to do all of that, you get 2 months of training. 2 months.
2 months. I was going to say, I was just about to guess like an entire school season, but no, 2 months.
No, 2 months. 2 months. Mind you, all you need is a bachelor's degree in literally anything. There was a guy, he had a degree in jazz saxophone. 2 months of training, and then he's supposed to essentially do what a cop does, but even more so. So with that 2 months of training, we can go out and basically ruin the lives of families, which I can go into in a second here. So for people maybe in Canada, I don't know if it works the same there, but from the horror stories I've heard, it seems similar. Essentially, how a case works with Child Protective Services is that a phone call is made to Child Protective Services headquarters. of alleged abuse. Now, this the person making the phone call could name themselves, or they might not even say who they are. But in either case, the alleged perpetrator will never know the name of the person alleging this abuse. Now, this abuse can be possibly that the child is being physically harmed, but in the vast majority of the cases, it involves either the parent using marijuana, the parent allowing the child to play outside, the parent not feeding the child the proper GMO foods because, oh no, they only eat organic and they don't vaccinate their kids, or that the child is being homeschooled or unschooled. Those are all considered in line with possible abuse.
Huh.
And
according to the government guidelines?
Yes.
So not sucking down the government line across the board is indicative of the fact that you are a liability. So what is this, a commercial for the movie Divergent? What's going on?
I mean, honestly, it's really, really sick stuff. And when it comes down to it, there was a case in Austin, Texas, where a guy who was a proponent of medical cannabis use, they didn't even catch him with any marijuana. Mm-hmm. They removed his kid, and his kid died in foster care in 2 weeks. This is real stuff. This is why
what was the guy using medical marijuana for? And did he have the official?
He was a proponent of it.
Okay.
So he was just making the political case for it. He was an activist.
Right.
And
okay.
Actually, and I'll go into the medicinal marijuana thing because it gets really, really shaky then.
Yeah, let's spend a bit of time there. But okay, sure, go on.
Okay, so from there, now it's important for people to realize that Child Protective Services, which is known as a number of different acronyms throughout the United States, but essentially the same thing everywhere. According to CPS and the United States government as a whole, the state owns the child. The parent does not own the child.
Well, yeah, you sign them away when you get them a birth certificate, from what I understand.
Essentially.
Yeah.
Well, actually, it's more so than that. In fact, I could go out to illegal immigrants and get their kids removed, even though they don't have a birth certificate here, even though they're not even technically a citizen. So it's any child in the United States, whether or not they're legal or not. So generally what Child Protective Services does is they don't even let the parent know about the case, right? They generally go out to the public school where the kid is at. So let's put you in a size 4 shoes. You're a kid.
Okay.
You've just joined public education. You're hanging out with this random aggregate of masses being told what to do, when to do it. Mm-hmm. So you might be a little flustered, a little bit scared, and then out of nowhere, this guy knocks on the door. He says, "Hi, I'm from Child Protective Services," as if you know what any of those words mean. Mm. That investigator, with his whole 2 months of training, brings this little kid to a room and starts asking him questions, a barrage of questions. Like, first, you always ask the light questions, like, what's your favorite color? Do you like going outside? And then you start asking more topical questions, like, have you ever touched your father's penis? When was the last time you touched your father's penis? How often are you hit? If you'll notice there, the majority of those questions are what's called leading questions.
Carlos, did you have a script that included these types of questions as an employee?
There were certain questions that we had to cover.
Okay.
So one of the questions is like, are you ever touched inappropriately? And it's case by case basis. So it depends on the alleged remarks. So we might ask a lot more questions in regards to drugs if it's alleged that the parent is using drugs in this particular case. Now, this kid in this particular case might be scared as hell. So what he's going to do is he's going to give you the answer that the caseworker wants, which is yes, there is abuse occurring because, well, honestly, those caseworkers, they usually suffer from pseudo-heroism. They want to be the hero. They want to go back to their supervisor and tell them, hey, look, everything's great. Everything's fine. There is abuse occurring, so let's go ahead and remove these kids. So from there, even with this shaky amount of evidence, I can then remove that child from that home before the parent even knows what's going on.
So I think a lot of this happens because, the criminality behind the mindset of doing it, from what you're going to get into shortly, I'm sure. But the part that sort of puzzles me is that, a lot of people just believe that they fully are in control of and responsible for their children. But like I said earlier, and you said they're apparently legally and technically they're not, and they are the property of the state. And so therefore the state can do these things and we can protest what they do, but they do have the legal ground to do it. So maybe the legal ground needs to be changed. But most people are thoroughly unaware of this fact.
Well, it's interesting that we're talking about legal ground because, the idea is that Child Protective Services has this great intention to protect children, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And 85% of removals by Child Protective Services are not for physical or sexual abuse. They're for what's called negligence, and negligence can be all those things I was discussing earlier, like unschooling, like the parent using marijuana, things like that. So I really don't buy the idea that any kind of reform is going to fix this, because I don't think it's in the incentive of the state to do so. I mean, if you talk about economically what occurs, for every single kid that is removed, the agency gets $4,000 to $6,000.
Okay,
right?
Now I wanted to ask about that because I'm relatively new to the topic, as I admitted at the beginning of the show, but many people believe that, police, city cops or highway cops, et cetera, have like a monthly quota of how many people they have to pull over and how many tickets they have to provide in order to bring in income, which shouldn't be a surprise when you realize a police force is not just a thing that is supposed to help people. It's actually a corporation that's trying to make money and profit. So they have a quota. So do you have a quota, or did you? And I'm speaking to you as a child care worker. Do you have a quota when you are making sure you're trying to bring in as many kids as you possibly? You just put a dollar figure on it. It seems logically that you would. Well,
so it wasn't stated as such whenever I was working for the agency. Like, they didn't have some piece of paper that said, hey, this is how much money you need to be given. This is the amount of revenue you have to bring in, i.e. kids. But instead, essentially got a raise every single year if you were an investigator. And the people who are removing the most amount of kids are seen as the ones who are working the hardest. So there's kind of slightly the emotional incentive to do so. And then if you're not getting many removals, the supervisors start getting on your back, assuming that you're not doing your job. Because according to Child Protective Services, pretty much everyone is guilty until proven innocent. When you're in training, you're basically taught that any single parent could potentially be an abuser. So it creates the same kind of environment that they teach those traffic cops, which is, at any single point, during any kind of traffic thing, this person could just shoot you. So you have to treat every single person that you talk to terribly, which is how you get that traffic cop mentality. They get a chip on their shoulder, and that's really, really easy to occur whenever you got people with only 2 months training. They don't know how human beings work. They don't know how to actually deal with communication skills, things like that.
What was your position there at the CPS, the Child Protective?
I was an investigator for Child Protective Services.
Okay. And this is a crazy idea, but have you ever seen the movie Monsters Incorporated?
A long time ago.
Okay. And they did a sequel last year or something, and I think it's interesting because they have a child detection services there as opposed to child protection services. And the basic crux of the film is, if you frighten children, we can use that energy to power the world. And then at the end of the movie, they realize accidentally that making them laugh is actually harvests and creates even more higher vibration and energy. And so no one needs to be scared anymore. Everybody just has a good time, and then they still power the world. But it's amazing in it how the child protective services agencies or detection services are portrayed. It's a good analogy, I think, of your former employer.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. And, it's that kind of fear that they thrust into the heart of society as a whole, because what Child Protective Services does is it helps the state run society from the inside, because if you control the developing souls, then you control everything. They get you a public schooling, which is, forced indoctrination camps. And then the security force for that is Child Protective Services. Is that if anyone's out of line, then they're able to distort and disrupt that situation as to better align with the status quo that they want. Yeah.
Well, I know you came down on them pretty hard earlier a few minutes ago. The Child Protective Services for you employing leading questions. But
yeah,
I'm not going to apologize for that, because this is the show that asks questions that don't seem to get a lot of mainstream coverage. So I probably won't be tipping the balance beam in the other direction. But I want to ask you, and I wondered if you had actually come across
families that were deep at the core rotten,
who are profiting from and
the majority
operating.
of people who actually profit from Child Protective Services are foster homes.
Okay.
So foster homes, of course, are granted more money for every single kid that comes in, which makes sense, right? Because if you have more kids, it means more people have to feed. Where it gets really nasty is for every single child that has a diagnosis, they also get more money. Which, okay, so the kid's paralyzed. You know, you might have to bring him to the hospital more often. You might have to fix up your house in order to be able to deal with him. But the other kind of diagnosis is mental diagnosis. So you're a kid. You've just been removed from your home, your community, your church, your school. You're thrown and thrusted into a foster home where you are very likely going to be abused statistically.
And is that foster home anywhere near your former neighborhood?
It depends, but in many of the cases, no. So
or even
you have
former
this
state.
situation where you're being removed from here. Now, you most likely are going to be having to hang out with other abused kids in this foster home, so you might be getting bullied. So it's possible that you might get angry. You might have emotional outbursts. You might not pay attention to school because who the hell cares about school? You just got removed from your home. And you might have issues sleeping. Now, to me and you, because we're rational folks, we would assume, you know what? It's the situation that's causing that. But according to a state health doctor, that child has oppositional defiant disorder, ADHD, bipolar
Sorry,
disorder,
oppositional, what was it?
Oppositional defiant disorder.
Okay, defied.
It's,
okay, right.
It's masters speak for slaves. It's people who defy authority, oppositional defiant disorder. You should look it up. It's pretty...
I should look it up. I'm living it. Go ahead.
Yeah. So from there, you know, with all those fun little diagnoses, that state doc has psychotropic drugs for each one of those. So there were 7-year-old kids on more than 8 psychotropic drugs that I met that put them in zombie-like states where they were
eight
not
psychotropic drugs. Did you say 8 psychotropic?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, that's incredible.
No, it was massively terrible. And when you go ahead and you look at the statistics of foster homes as a whole, so I recently I released this video called "Foster Homes Where Good Kids Go to Die."
Okay, I want to interrupt here and say I know some foster kids, people that were foster kids who have nothing but great things and love.
Absolutely.
This is not a tarring the feather everybody involved. That's okay. So there are some bad apples, as George Bush would say.
Okay, so we can say bad apples. Make that, to me, makes it sound like it's rarer.
Okay, how about this? There are a few good apples. You good with
There's
that?
a few good apples. I'm cool with that one.
I know some good apples, so I'm not tarring everybody with the same brush.
Let me give you just some stats of the aggregate, not the individual here.
Okay.
So foster kids are 7-8 times more likely to be abused than children in normal households. Nearly half will end up homeless whenever they leave at the age of 18. They're 3 times more likely to be put on psychotropic drugs for the reasons that I mentioned. 7 times more likely to develop an eating disorder. They're more likely to have PTSD than veterans of war and less likely to recover from that PTSD. More likely to become pregnant as a teenager than children who were abused and were in a similar situation without being removed. Also 20% more likely to be arrested. And the staggering one is children are 6 times more likely to die in a foster home than if they stayed in an abusive household.
How do you come up with these statistics?
You can go over to my website at truthovercomfort.net. There is a lot of research and statistical analysis that is all there for everyone else to do. I don't do these studies. I collect them. And some of these are actually from the 7-8 times more likely to 3 times more likely psychotropic drugs. Those are actually coming from childwelfare.gov. It's not like they're on some Prison Planet website or something like that. Not that I'm dismissing that.
No, but you want to try and find it in the
incentive to bring up that news. Childwelfare.gov does not.
It's incredible to me because I'm pretty sure if you mentioned before, if you're being filmed, so you put your hands behind your back so as not to appear aggressive in that manner. But if you were being filmed doing 2 or 3 of those things to some kid, you'd probably be in the back of a cop car right now.
Yeah. And there's been a few different cases. So again, my website is truthovercomfort.net, and through that website, people can contact me who are having issues with Child Protective Services.
Truthovercomfort.net. Okay.
Yeah, which I get quite a few messages on a daily basis in regards to dealing with foster homes, dealing with removals, and I do most of this stuff for free. I take donations for people who can afford it. But you know, it's case after case of just the state abusing people. One of my cases there was a guy who had spent $200,000 trying to disprove a claim of a sexual molestation that he supposedly did to his child. And I was talking to him. I said, hey, can you get the recording from the CPS investigator? Because in a lot of cases, CPS investigators actually record their conversations with the kid. When they finally got it, the case got taken out because it turns out the investigator was asking a whole host of questions that were trying to lead the child into making false allegations.
Yeah, like when did you stop beating your wife, that kind of thing?
Essentially, yes. And, you know, there's a really good example of this leading questions things. Do you remember that this happened in the U.S. in the early 90s? There was supposedly satanic ritualistic abuse occurring in daycare.
Yeah.
Okay? So a bunch of people went to jail for it. The only thing is, it turns out none of it was true. So CPS went to these daycare and essentially ascertained from questions that the children were answering that the daycare workers were getting on brooms, flying around the room, right? That they were taking children, flushing them down toilets, and sticking machetes up the rectum of babies. Now, mind you, there was no physical evidence of any of this. And you'd think if a bunch of raping and on a machete rectal play, you'd assume there'd be a lot of physical evidence. So
Go ahead.
I don't think I've ever put that sentence together.
No,
like that.
machete rectal play. That is that's a new one for me, and I'm not about to try it, but it sounds funny coming off the mouth.
Yeah. So what they did was they then they went to the media and they're like, oh, well, they didn't bring up any of the flying or anything because they're like, well, that's nuts, right? So instead, what they said was that there was raping going on and that there was like sacrificing and stuff like that. And with this shaky evidence, they were able to throw a bunch of people in jail. And it wasn't until the FBI came in and did just a tad bit of actual investigation work and were able to get the majority of those people out of prison. Now, you know, for all of that, for all the chaos that those Child Protective Service workers did, destroying the lives of a lot of those kids, you know, they really screwed them up. And destroying the lives of these daycare workers, not a single CPS investigator went to jail for this. None of them. You know, some were fired. Boo-hoo. You lost your job kidnapping kids.
Seems like a lot of the upper echelon in these organizations manage to escape any kind of justice. Like there's no heavy hitter in the financial world who's done any time outside of Iceland, you know? So we just let people get away with the huge crimes and then try to profit and nickel and dime everybody else and squeeze them out for these little crimes, which probably aren't even crimes.
Yeah, and the thing is that now that one case sounds a bit insane, like it's just a case of a few bad apples, but things like that occur on a much more subtle level every day in CPS headquarters, because CPS cases aren't just based on what happened yesterday; they can be based off something that happened 2 years ago, and not even something that someone saw firsthand. The agency uses evidence that is based off the memory of the stories that someone heard over a year ago. So what can occur is, you're talking to this guy, and he kind of related to the family, and he overheard a year ago that the child is being abused. And with that evidence, that's considered legitimate evidence enough to be able to get a removal.
In a court, I believe it's called hearsay evidence, and it's not valid.
Yeah. So that investigator who's actually told not to copy the information word for word, but instead take small notes, and then use their own judgment to place the information into a database in narrative form, as in they are told to create a story based off their own memory, you know, that is considered evidence. So you got memory off the memory off the memory off the memory of someone else. Now, you know, there's a really good kids game that should show you why this is a bad idea. You ever heard of the telephone game?
Yeah, the broken telephone, sure.
Yeah, so one kid says to another, says to another, says to another, and by the very end, you know, you end up with a totally different story. Mm-hmm. And of course, that occurs in, say, 5 minutes with a kid's game, and it ends with an insightful giggle. This happens over a couple of years and ends with the destruction of a family.
Yeah, and maybe you paid $200,000 to disprove it.
Yeah. Now, you know, what makes the telephone game even worse is that the adults playing it have their own incentives to fabricate. You know, parents dealing in divorce cases can gain custody by making up allegations of abuse. In most cases, it's sexual abuse because those are the hardest to disprove.
Well, that's always why I've said you should never marry those people.
You can find majority of the things I'm discussing here on my website at truthovercomfort.net. So what we were discussing was the topic of false allegations when it comes to child protective services. Because again, allegations are considered evidence according to CPS. Now, one of the points I was bringing up with it was parents dealing in divorce cases can make up allegations of abuse occurring in order to be able to gain custody, because divorce court can take, say, 6 to 9 months to have to deal with when it comes to custody battles. But if you have child protective services involved and say you even make a false claim of domestic violence, you can go to court in 2 weeks, get all the custody you want, and get a boatload of money from whomever the dad is in this particular case. Now, there are other cases of false allegations outside of that kind of parental arrangement, like neighbors who are, say, having an argument with their neighbors, make up false allegations of abuse that is supposedly occurring in the house. For instance, in one particular case, this neighbor was stating that his person living right by them was a member of the Mexican mafia, was snorting cocaine off of prostitutes, and that there was guns and drugs, heroin, speed, and all that good stuff in the house.
Mexican prostitutes?
Yeah, well, I don't know, Mexican mafia. I assume Mexican prostitutes, the part of the town that I was in.
Okay, I'm just trying to paint a picture in my mind. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Just imagine the Wolf of Wall Street, but everybody's Hispanic and much, much poorer. And so with these false, there's all these false allegations. So I went ahead and I talked to these people. I was like, holy crap, Mexican mafia, this is going to be intense, Mm-hmm. And all of it was completely disproved. And when I talked to the neighbor, he was like, yeah, I mean, I might have made up some of that, but I mean, they're bad people.
I might have.
And if you make these allegations, you should be punished equally.
Yeah, I'm laughing, but it's so ridiculous. I can't help it.
Yeah, and it gets worse and worse. There's public school teachers who will make up false allegations against kids not being medicated enough because they don't like the kid. So they're like, oh, the kid obviously has oppositional defiant disorder, ADHD, to the point where there recently. A SWAT team was going towards a parent's house because the parent wasn't drugging their kid in psychotropic drugs. Okay, a SWAT team. Are you kidding me? And this is what is considered protecting children in America. Sending a SWAT team to drug kids.
Yeah, and well, they've sent SWAT teams in to get people that like to make their own milk. So, I mean, there's no barrier apparently anymore. There's no barrier for state invasion.
Yeah, and after an investigator gathers their information through completely outdated, disproven, and downright immoral tactics that consciously or unconsciously lead to a fair amount of false allegations, and this can occur before the parent is even questioned, well, with this evidence, a phone call can be made to a judge, and that judge can give orders for a child to be removed from his parents and into the shackles of the state.
Right.
And a lot of this stuff, when I expose these things, so I'm in New Hampshire. I am kind of involved with libertarians over here at the Free State Project. I used to work with another group in Asheville, North Carolina. It's interesting to me how few libertarians are actually discussing this because, there's 250,000 kids in CPS care right now.
Well, there ought to be a law against that.
Yeah, no, and that's the thing is that so many people, they hear, well, what are we going to do if there's no child protective services? Well, that's like asking a libertarian, what are we going to do about heroin addicts if the Drug Enforcement Agency isn't around anymore? The Child Protective Services incentive is to kidnap kids and make up allegations and to enforce the drug war. So we were discussing earlier in the show medicinal marijuana.
Right.
Now in California, kids are still being removed from homes even if a parent has a medicinal marijuana license. Okay? So they're essentially using that license as a license to remove a child. They're using it as evidence against them.
That's pretty bad news for someone that wanted to prevent himself from being ill by growing a plant in some dirt, don't you think?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. So when it comes to protecting children, well, let's remove the state's abuse of children. Let's take kids out of these public indoctrination camps where they're being, basically they're promoting illiteracy.
They are. I was in a bookstore in a town called Kingston, Ontario, a great old bookstore. I hope it's still there. And a couple of years ago, I found a reader for the province of Ontario. It was called a Level 6 reader, and I don't even know if that means you're in grade 6 or the 6th grade. I don't even know what it means, but it was called that. It was an Ontario school thing from like 1890, and I can't even understand it. I mean, it's like I don't even think most university students, and this is like, basic stuff, and it's hard to understand. It's incredibly complex, and over the years, if you want to fish out some textbooks, they do get simpler and easier and less involved and probably less true.
Did you ever research Jonathan Taylor Gatto, underground history of education?
Yes, he's a fantastic former teacher. It's people like you who used to work at Child Protective Services that know what's going on. And Gatto was a teacher, and he can so artfully expose the ridiculousness and inefficiency of that system.
Yeah, he was bringing up, like Last of the Mohicans was like the number one seller whenever it first came out, and this was a couple hundred years ago. And if you look at how difficult of a read that is in comparison to, say, what's the best-selling reader now? Twilight.
Yeah, or Danielle Steele.
It's Twilight, and you're like, wow, how dumb are people?
Yeah, it's a lot.
This is one of the worst things I've ever read. Really, really submissive woman with a terrible understanding of humans completely. It falls in love with a guy who's 110 years old and so creepy that he's still in high school.
Right.
Yeah. This all makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah.
And if you look at Cato Institute showed this thing where essentially the more and more money that they've spent on public education, the lower the literacy rates have went. So it's
gone.
It's really a damn shame when it comes to this. So when you think about, I get into I came to libertarianism through child advocacy work. We were trying to prevent kids from being hit and abused and stuff. And the question always comes up, what are we going to do if we don't have the state? Well, if we remove public education, public indoctrination, and we remove child protective services, child kidnapping services, well, that'll be a heck of a way to start, at least, as far as being able to help out the least offended minority that we have, which is children across the United States.
They're a minority, is that right?
I think of them as not a. I think they're almost treated worse than a minority would be allowed to be treated.
Right.
So, if you think 60 or 70 years ago, it was the rationalizations for hitting a woman where I had to keep her in line. She wasn't listening. She wasn't doing what I was telling her to do. And that same kind of justification cannot be used anymore to hit a woman. You wouldn't go, oh my God, what? You can't just hit a woman. She has the independence. She has self-ownership. She's allowed to be able to do what she wants. But when it comes to children, that is flipped completely on its head. The blaming goes towards the child not behaving. So in many ways, children are being routinely treated worse than women were 60 to 80 years ago.
Well, I still don't think we should give them the vote, but I agree. That is brutal. So what can we do now about people? I mean, they can contact you at your website, obviously, but what can people do to awaken themselves to the fact that, I think the crux of your argument is that as a libertarian, it is coming from you as a libertarian with the knowledge of a former CPS worker. And it's like, we need to alert people to the control systems that we pay for, by the way. You didn't even mention that all the money we pay to have this done to us. It's not even like a third-party entity. It's like you're the one paying to have it happen. And that is where people need to come together and say, we got to do something. But you know what? I think a great idea would be to do is to stop buying anything for one day. These people, they've got some kind of don't buy anything day. And that, if you look at it mathematically, would be powerful. And it would make corporations say, hey, wait a minute. We gotta be a little more considerate. But it'll never happen. And I'm a cynic. I think that should happen. And I'm also thinking that it'll never happen. And if we can't even just organize ourselves to not buy gasoline one day to kick the oil companies in the butt, then I really doubt that the world's going to come together and say, hey, we've rid ourselves of this unnecessary agency that we paid to punish our kids. I don't think it's going to go away any more than changing from fuel, that doesn't pollute, or that pollutes from fuel that doesn't pollute.
So activism's a tricky thing. So a lot of people try to go for the reform move, right? Like, we got to reform public education. We got to reform child protective services. But once you understand the incentive structure, you realize they have no incentive to reform. So instead, the best way to deal with it is to get them out of the situation. So in other words, understand if you're going to want to deal with child protective services, you're going to want to basically stay out of their way as much as possible. And knowing what child protective services is a good start. Now, I've outlined in other speeches before how to deal with child protective services. I mean, first off, don't ever tell your kids, if they're in public school, don't ever talk to a child protective service investigator, no matter what. They're allowed to legally talk to them, but they don't have to say anything.
Right.
And if you tell your friends about child protective services, they'll know not to talk to them at all. So instead, they're going to actually have to come to your door and talk to you. Now, if you have the money, don't talk to them at all. Get your family court attorney on the line. Say, hey, this is going on right now. It might cost you a few bucks, but guess what? You've paid a ton of money just to protect your kid throughout your life. You might have it all destroyed by the CPS investigator. Now, if you don't have money at all, then you're going to have to talk to this guy. And so the main things to do are don't admit to any prior drug use, right? I don't care if you did. I'm not telling you to tell the truth here. This isn't your therapist. This is the enemy. Don't admit to any prior drug use. Don't admit to any prior domestic violence. If you've been hit by your husband, I apologize. If your wife hit you, I'm sorry. But again, they're not your therapist. And they can use, oh, my husband hit me 2 years ago, but he's been out of the house since then. They can use that as enough evidence in order to remove a child from a home. So say as little as possible. Don't contradict yourself. And a very important thing, besides just denying, is also to not sign any of the paperwork. I mean, I just had people just sign over medical release forms like it was nothing, because they've been dealing with the state their whole lives. You know,
well, this is the thing. I mean, you have the power because they want you to sign it. And if you don't sign it, nothing happens. And they'll stand there and say, sign it. And eventually you're the one that signs it. And you just need to say, I'm not signing it. And that's it.
They can still come and that's the thing.
It's true. But what is the power of the signature? Why do we have to commit ourselves with a signature? There's a key there.
Yeah, the law when it comes to child protective services is very, very unclear, and it's incredibly subjective and arbitrary, just like the state in general.
Okay.
So even if you do all these correct things, they could still get a removal by making up things. And in that particular case, if you go to court, you need to get a family court attorney. I've seen judges laugh at people, okay, because they weren't dressed well enough and they didn't know exactly how to defend themselves in court. So you're going to need a family court attorney with you there just out of protection.
And a style consultant, apparently. That is, unfortunately, a sad statement. Listen, Carlos, the great thing about internet radio shows is they can go on endlessly. Unfortunately, we have an hour, and we've got to bring this to a close. But I thank you for your information and some great ideas on how to avoid these creeps and enjoy your life instead of being subject to somebody else's carnal whims.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me on. Again, all this information and a lot more can be found at truthovercomfort.net, and it has all the contact information for that. So if you're in any kind of issues right now, or if you just have kids in general, this is important information for you to know. So definitely check that website out.
Very generous of you. Thanks for being a turncoat and away from the bad guys and back with the good guys, Carlos.
Absolutely. You have a great day.
Thanks for listening to Conspiracy Queries with Alan Park. Please offer comments or complaints by emailing conspiracyqueries@gmail.com or on Twitter @con_queries or at our website, conspiracyqueries.com. Thanks for listening.